Thank you very much. It's an extraordinary pleasure and privilege to be part of this panel and also to follow Professor Skidelsky in that very astute intervention. I'm not going to say that the issue is different in developing countries, but I will try and take a more developing country perspective. And I think one of the central issues is something that has already been highlighted by Lord Skidelsky, which is really that in developing countries dominantly characterized by high informality, or shall we say just lack of protection, by excess labor, and by a continuing need for productive transformation, we have a fundamental problem, which is that the avenues that were available to the industrialized countries are no longer available to us. The whole process that was mentioned, that, if you like, the Kuznets-Clark kind of transformation, or even the Kaldorian transformation, where you move from primary to secondary to tertiary sectors, that's no longer easily accessible in terms of employment shifts. We know that agriculture will employ less and less people, and that's good because a lot of that work is very arduous and full of drudgery. We know that manufacturing will employ less and less people, which is also in a sense good because a lot of that was smokestack industries and so on and so forth. But we also know that the new and modern services employ less and less people, especially communication technology and so on and so forth. And the robotization of a whole range of other services is equally evident. Last evening, Professor Skidelsky and I were in a bar where there were no human beings, and we had great difficulty using the machines to access the glasses of wine and the bags of peanuts. But what this means, is that there is really, that traditional pattern is not available. So we really have to think of more creative ways of productive transformation in terms of actually shifting workforce into higher value-added activities. That's a huge challenge, and I don't think it is one that we have even begun to conceptualize properly. Now, in terms of the role of technology, Professor Skidelsky quite rightly said that, it has no boundaries. It's not that we can keep it confined to the OECD countries and so on. And we are all faced with the same processes of technological change. I'd like to make a distinction between two different kinds of technological change, the productive versus the disruptive. Now, the productive is also disruptive. We know that there is creative destruction, as Raymond described it, in terms of the creation of some jobs and the dissolution of many other jobs. But productive technologies broadly increase productivity in the society as a whole. Disruptive technologies, on the other hand, are really enabling conditions for organizational changes. And the sort of classic example of that is Uberization. It is the possibility of using technologies to change the organization of work or production in ways that essentially reduce the power of workers. Or really, if I can summarize it in one word, it leads to the increase in piecework. This is evident in the services, it's evident in manufacturing, in the value chains, and so on. What it really means is that you're passing on the costs and the risks of work and the risks of production to the actual workers themselves. And it's not necessarily more productive, but it is a very, very significant organizational change that is enabled by technology. Now, how do we deal with these? Well, in terms of, if you like, the disruptive technologies, I do believe the answer has to come from different forms of regulation of production and of work and societal responses. And I think that requires another way of thinking. It requires a social dissemination of the need for those regulatory changes. Because these are not necessarily changes that are, shall we say, desirable for society as a whole, but they are organizational changes that effectively pass on costs and risks to the workers themselves. But what do we do about the creative destruction part, the productive changes that Lord Skidelsky was highlighting, the ones that actually throw out lots of people from work through automation and so on? We can't fight against it. It's pointless to try. And I would argue we can't even try and delay these and slow them down in a way that is socially, shall we say, manageable. What we really need to think of doing is how do we transform the surpluses that are generated in these more productive activities into demand for more employment-intensive work? And I think that's the central question. we don't fight these changes. We accept them, we possibly embrace them. But we think of how we transform those surpluses into work, into investments and demand that will actually create more employment elsewhere. And that employment will be in activities that improve the quality of life. There's a whole range of things that we can think of in that. It could be in the care economy, which is going to become more and more important with demographic changes, in entertainment broadly defined, in the creative industries, and a whole range of activities. How do we do this? We can try and do it directly, that is through fiscal transfers, through a combination of taxing and public spending. Very difficult in today's political environment, for sure, but nonetheless something that we can't just abandon. We can't throw up our hands and say it's no longer possible, because the social contract and, if you like, the political economy of these things can and must change, I believe, if we are to survive as societies in both developed and developing worlds. But it can also be done through changing incentives that are thrown up by the market. It can be done by altering the ways in which markets respond to the kinds of employment that are generated. And I do believe we need to think creatively about the kinds of policies that can do that. Finally, I'd just like to take up the issue of, Raymond mentioned this, how work patterns are changing and that there are many more different kinds of work, part-time and so on and so forth. I would also argue that there is a huge change in terms of how people work, in that they no longer have one single occupation. And this is extremely widespread in the developing world. Our labor force surveys are unable to capture it because they typically will have one primary and one secondary occupation at the very best. But we do know, I mean, I have seen discussions, I have met people who work part-time on a field. They also work as, they lift luggage in the railway station. They act as transporters for others. And on the side, they also do a small betting business. I mean, in the developing world, you will find people doing many, many things over the course of one day or 1 week. So we need to be able to capture that and think of how to make all those activities part of what is called decent work. Most of all, we also need to recognize the significance and the continued significance of unrecognized and unpaid work. How do we actually manage its social distribution and how to address it? Of course, there is the issue, it's summed up, I think, beautifully in the doctrine of recognizing it, reducing it, and redistributing it. But that's easy to say, and it's much more complex to work out. But we do know that this unpaid work will become more and more significant, also because of the demographic changes that are putting more and more pressure on the care economy, and therefore we have to address that as well. I think the discussion that Lord Skidelsky outlined is, in a sense, reaching towards a notion of work. And here I want to also applaud the ILO for distinguishing between work and employment and talking about the future of work rather than employment. But I think he identified the nature of work really, in a sense, as non-alienated labor. So I think, in a sense, if we are looking for an ideal, we also should perhaps be looking at the future of work. The ideal we should strive for is of achieving non-alienated labor. But of course, there are huge steps and possible missteps on that way. Thank you.